This video is the first of 4 videos that establishes the foundation for your upcoming work in the International Business class. Now, the purpose of this video is to give you some sound, basic instruction on how to get the process moving. I do not expect you to be an expert at the end of this. I want you to concentrate on collecting the necessary information for the project, organizing it, and making some initial decisions. Now, I'm going to be pulling a great deal of information from the internet, so I want to make sure that you have a list of cited sources from where we're pulling the information. This information will also appear on the individual slides. So let's start off with reviewing the assignment. The paper is to be completed in 3 parts. The first part is about the product. You should select a product that you want to import or export. Remember, there are over 10,000 classifications in the tariff, so most every product you can imagine is represented. In the first part, you should also research specific details about the product. Now, the second part of the project involves selecting a country with which to trade, and in this section we will look at country level controls and whether or not the product you selected can be sold or bought there. We will look at the customs of the country and business etiquette, as well as the business environment in general. We will also look at trade agreements and documents required in this part. And in the third section, we will perform a basic risk analysis. After all, if you want to do business in a particular country, it is a good idea to look at the types of risks that exist in that country. And by the end of the project, you should have a relatively complete transaction, including the prepared documents. Regardless of which method of market entry you select for your business, chances are there will be some physical product that is transiting the border. And at the very basic level, the movement of product through the border includes a minimum of 4 important players. You have the shipper, which is usually the seller, the supplier, or the manufacturer. You have the transportation company, which can be an ocean carrier, an air carrier, or a trucking company. You have the buyer, usually at the destination, and the entire process is coordinated through some type of intermediary, customs broker, or freight forwarder that clears the shipment with the destination company's customs administration and sees to it that the product is delivered. In complex transactions, you could have additional intermediaries like quality inspection firms, distributors, banks, installation companies, and government representatives. In this video, we're going to keep things as simple as possible. But to give you some examples of how complicated a supply chain can get, let's just take a look at some of the examples here. Now, at UNICEF, there are several different parties that are involved in the supply chain beyond the basics. Now, because UNICEF does not manufacture, but procures instead for distribution, their supply chain does not include a manufacturer. It does include planners who assess the needs of the children and the volumes required to meet those needs. Budgeting and planning get involved when the dollars get involved. The procurement department or procurement agency procures what is needed. Delivery and clearance occurs. Now, clearance in this case, I am assuming delivery and clearance includes not only customs clearance, but also regulatory clearance as well. I'm sure that things can get complicated when working with the different countries which UNICEF supports. And this slide looks like UNICEF is proposing adding all the additional functions to the supply chain beyond the traditional focus, which includes budgeting, planning, and procurement. They want to add inspections, warehousing operations, and distribution, and ultimately they want to add work with the beneficiaries and a dedicated function of monitoring and evaluation. Now, this diagram is drawn up by the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, and this supply chain indicates how supplies or product arrive at the Port of Shanghai via rail car for loading and delivery to the Port of Long Beach via ocean carrier. And the cargo is again loaded on a rail car and is sent to their distribution point. And the second diagram is based out of Europe, and even though it is coming out of a different geographic location, you can see that the 2 philosophies are closely aligned and that the cargo leaves the Port of Rotterdam on ship and arrives in the Port of Jacksonville, and the cargo is again loaded on a rail car and is sent to the distribution point in Texas. And in this example, They established their domestic supply chain separately, and it looks like they use primarily railroad services to distribute their products to the distribution point. Now, one of the most interesting supply chains is the food-related supply chain. Most people do not have an appreciation for how complex the supply chain can become. In the food supply chain, Emerald insights go all the way back in the chain to the suppliers of fertilizer. Now, the fertilizer goes to the farmers from the chemical industry and from research institutions. Farmers are not going to convert their harvest into a form suitable for use in the manufacturing industry. So they will either sell their harvest to an exporter or to a cooperative. And the job of the cooperative is to pull all the harvest from all the farmers and negotiate large commercial sales to the processors. And the cooperatives will try to get the highest sales price they can in order to offer solid purchase prices to the growers. And globally, the exporter will sell the harvest overseas and then transport it to the port of export. The importers and foreign wholesalers will receive the harvest and arrange for distribution. Domestically, the cooperatives provide their product to the manufacturing plants who manufacture final food products and then the food products re-enter the supply chain at the wholesale level for distribution. Now, petroleum is also an interesting supply chain to look at, and this supply chain is provided by David Wood and Associates. In this case, they take their supply chain all the way back to the exploration process. Once crude oil is discovered, it is produced or drilled, transported by pipeline to shipping vessels who deliver the crude to refineries, and the refined product is further distributed through the pipeline. The product is then stored in strategically located storage terminals and distributed from there to the industrial and consumer markets. Clothing is another interesting supply chain because it may include a manufacturing process in more than one country. This supply chain provided by Emerald Insight only goes back to the point of fabric and accessory suppliers, and not the growers of cotton, the manufacturer of synthetic fibers, and the producers of silk. You can just imagine how complex that could get. In this supply chain, buyer offices and sourcing agents are involved. So I think these examples properly illustrate how dynamic and how creative a company can be with designing their supply chain. It is an art as well as a science. As a general rule, the more parties you have in the supply chain, the higher the final price to the customer. The faster your supply chain moves, the more attention you have to pay to cost management. Either you're going to incur additional cost in your planning function so that you can reduce cost and rely on ocean transport, which is slower, or you're going to find yourself dependent upon air carriers, which they can deliver very quickly, but they are very expensive. And it all depends on the decisions made by your company and your assessments as to the and your assessments as the manager of that function. Now, if you're going to export product, you will be the supplier or the seller. If you're going to import product, you will be the customer at the destination or the buyer. And you can place yourself at either end of the supply chain, but it is something that you should decide up front. So in essence, the supplier is going to provide the product and arrange for its transport through some type of carrier or intermediary. The product will be picked up from the supplier and taken to the transportation hub. Now, if the product is going via ocean carrier or ocean container, it will be delivered to the port. If it is going via air freight, it will be delivered to a consolidation point at the airport. If it is going to be delivered by truck, say you are shipping to Canada or Mexico, it would be picked up by a truck or a consolidator. And after it arrives at the loading point, it will be put on a conveyance. Now, conveyance is just another word for the means of transportation. So a truck is a conveyance, an ocean carrier is a type of a conveyance, and so forth. Now, there are numerous rules about when you have to have your cargo at the loading point in order to meet the conveyance. For instance, if a ship sails out on Friday morning, you may have to have your cargo delivered to the port by Tuesday afternoon at 3 p.m. It is typical that in an ocean port, your container must be at the port 3 days before vessel departure in order to sail on time. It is based upon the same type of principle that you encounter when you fly somewhere. The airline expects you to go to the airport 2 or 3 hours before your departure time in order to make sure that all requirements are met and the airplane leaves on time. It is the same with international transport. So don't make the mistake of thinking that just because a container is scheduled to leave at a certain time and date, on a certain date, that you can send the cargo to that ship at the last minute. Chances are that is not going to work for you. Everyone else is trying to get their cargo to the vessel as well, so it is not uncommon to see 30 or 40 trucks lined up at a busy port waiting to get inside the gates. So now I want you to take a breather. This includes part 1 of a 4-part video lecture. And to review I think you should review the checklist that is provided for this assignment. Is there anything that you can research now in order to get your project launched? Certainly, at this point, you should have your product selected. You should have decided whether or not you will be the buyer or the seller, and you should have decided with which country you will be trading. If you have decided those things at this point, you're probably in a good position to begin with part 2. You may even want to consider doing a few minutes of research on the internet about typical supply chains in your product area.